Good evening, everyone. What a great crowd. It is so nice to see this wonderful church full tonight. I think you are in for a real treat. My name is Phil Fioramonti, and I work for Senator Sanders as his outreach director here in Burlington. And this event, as you know, is a town meeting on Wall Street and the big banks and what we can do about it. And as I said, you're in for a treat, and we're so delighted that Matt Taibbi can be with us here tonight. I do want to mention this event is co-sponsored with some organizations in Burlington, in the state of Vermont, the Vermont AFL-CIO, the Vermont NEA, the VSEA, the state employees, the Vermont Workers Center, and the United Electrical Workers. And we thank them for their help in turning folks out. You know, one of the things that is really special, I think you all know about Bernie, is his foresight. You know, he sees things far in advance of when they happen. He's got vision, you know, things like single-payer health care. Bernie was talking about when he was mayor of Burlington in the 1980s. And I was reminded of his foresight when I came across a New York Times article written in October of 2008 at the time of the economic downturn. And they were trying to understand how our economy was brought to the brink of total collapse. And the story referred to a House Banking Committee hearing. Bernie sat on the House Banking Committee in the House of Representatives, and that was in 2000, this hearing. And this article in the New York Times wrote about that hearing in 2000. And here is what it said, quote, "Later in 2000, at a congressional hearing on the merger boom, Alan Greenspan, Federal Reserve Chairman, argued that Wall Street had tamed risk. Representative Bernard Sanders, an independent from Vermont, asked, quote, aren't you concerned with such a growing concentration of wealth that if one of these huge institutions fails, that it will have a horrendous impact on the national and global economy? No, I'm not, Mr. Greenspan replied. Well, you know who was right and you know who was wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce your United States Senator, Bernie Sanders.
Phil, thank you, and thank you all very much for coming out. This is a great turnout, and I want you to know that earlier this afternoon at UVM, we also had a meeting where hundreds of young people came out to listen to Matt. In my experience, there is a correlation in terms of media coverage, and that is the more important the issue, the less coverage you see. So if there is something silly and absurd, you could see it around the clock on CNN. If there is something that impacts our nation and people all over the world in the most fundamental way, the likelihood is you'll hear very little about it. Now, what I love about Matt Taibbi is that Matt has had the courage and the ability to take a look at one of the most important issues, not only facing our country, but the entire world. And he's had the ability to dissect it, to have the courage to take on some of the most powerful people in the world and write about it in a way that ordinary people can understand. Not in some professorial language, but in a way that people can understand. Now let me say a little bit about the issue and my experience with it. In my view, you understand nothing about our economy, nothing about the political life of this nation, unless you begin to deal with the issue of Wall Street. Because the wealth of Wall Street, the money of Wall Street, is literally beyond people's imagination. Here's what you're dealing with today. Today, just the 6 top financial institutions have assets of over $9 trillion. They write 2/3 of the credit cards in this country, and half of the mortgages and produce 95% of the derivatives. Now, what Phil was talking about when my interaction with Alan Greenspan was during the 80s, Wall Street, of course, wanted to become deregulated. They wanted to move away from the restrictions that were placed upon them during the Great Depression, appropriately so, Glass-Steagall and other pieces of legislation. Over a 10-year period, Wall Street spent $5 billion on lobbying and campaign contributions in order to achieve their goal. $5 billion. And today, after the passage of the very modest Dodd-Frank legislation, they are back on Capitol Hill spending huge sums of money to try to weaken or do away with any of the more serious provisions in that legislation. Some of you may have heard, although it really did not get as much attention as it certainly deserved, that at a hearing last month, the Attorney General of the United States of America made an extraordinary statement. Are you familiar with what he said? All right, here's what he said. He said that right now, because we have such an extraordinary concentration of ownership in the financial industries, that these banks are so powerful that he hesitates to prosecute these financial institutions, because if you prosecute them and you bring instability to these institutions, it could have an impact on our national and world economy. In other words, these banks are not only now too big to fail, they are too big to jail. Think for a moment. Some kid throws a rock through a window, that's a crime, kid is punished. A large financial institution commits a crime which impacts tens of millions of people, but because they are so big, so powerful, because their economic tentacles stretch out all over our country and impact millions and millions of people, they have become untouchable. Now, in terms of the size of these financial institutions, you all know, against my vote, that in 2008, they were bailed out. They were bailed out by the Congress to the tune of $700 billion. And they were bailed out, and I was at this meeting, after Secretary of Treasury Hank Paulson, Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Fed, walked into a meeting with 100 senators and, roughly speaking, said the following: if you do not give me a check for $700 billion, the likelihood is that within the coming week, the financial system of the United States and perhaps the world will collapse. That's what we were told. Now, for a variety of reasons, I happen not to think. My question to Mr. Paulson, who came from Goldman Sachs, was, if your friends caused this problem, why don't your friends bail out the banks? That really is, he didn't think that was a good idea. All right, but here's the interesting point. Today, 6 years later, 5.5 years later, you'll all be delighted to know that every one of these large financial institutions that were too big to fail are now significantly larger than they were before we bailed them out. Got that? All right. So in terms of clout and impact on our economy, literally the problem that we have, and I think maybe the problem Matt is going to have to convey to you, the story is so big. These people are so powerful that it is almost hard to deal with. Almost hard to deal with. I will give you another story about their power. And this ties into Citizens United, which all of you know is that disastrous Supreme Court decision that allows big money to buy elections, okay? You will remember that last year a big deal was made about the fact that Jamie Dimon and J.P. Morgan Chase, quote unquote, lost $4 or $5 billion. Remember that? A lot of hearings and discussion about it. Turns out that in the Fed, in the New York Fed, guess who was sitting on the New York Fed whose goal it is to regulate Wall Street banks? Anybody know who's sitting on the Fed? My God, it's the same guy, Jamie Dimon. So here you have the CEO of the largest financial institution in the country sitting on the Fed, whose job it is to regulate large financial institutions. I brought forth honestly what I thought was a modest amendment that said that representatives of large banks should not sit on the Fed to regulate. That's a pretty modest amendment, right? I mean that. This is say, let's get the fox out of the henhouse. Do you know how many co-sponsors I got for that amendment? Two. And the reason for that is that I think many of my colleagues who certainly agreed with the direction of where I was coming from were really afraid. Because what Citizens United is about, if you stand up to Wall Street, you stand up to the coal companies, you stand up to the insurance companies, you go home, and you're going to be faced in your next election with zillions of dollars of ugly 30-second ads, and they chose not to do it. So we're dealing with an institution of enormous economic clout, enormous political power. And let me say this, some of you will agree with me, some of you may not. The truth is there are real differences between the Democratic and Republican parties on a lot of issues. But on the issue of Wall Street, ain't a whole lot of difference. Because Wall Street is so powerful that really the only difference is Bush appoints people from Goldman Sachs, Obama appoints people from Citigroup. I guess that's the difference. But Wall Street is so powerful that they will dominate the financial advisors and secretaries of Treasury of whichever party is in power. So, as I mentioned before, the reason I like Matt so much is he has delved into an issue of unbelievable consequence. You don't know anything about the economy until you know about Wall Street, and he has done it with great courage. And I'm just very proud that he's with us tonight in Burlington. Let's welcome Matt Taibbi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm incredibly honored to be here. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. I also want to thank Senator Sanders for having me here. It's a huge honor for me to be able to come and do this with him. I've known the senator for many years. Actually, many years. I guess it was about 8 years ago. We worked together on a story. He very graciously invited me to tag along with him for a whole month while he was in the House. And the purpose of that story was sort of to teach people about how the House really worked and how what really goes on in Congress and how hard it is to get amendments passed and how frustrating it is when you get them passed and they get struck down anyway. And it was an incredibly enlightening experience for me, but there's a funny story about this actually that I never told him. When I pitched this story to my editors, I said that I had this opportunity to spend a month with a Congressman Bernie Sanders from Vermont. My editor said, oh, Sanders, he's the one who cares, right? And this is nothing else for me sums up what Bernie Sanders is all about better than that. I think you don't need me to tell you that you're incredibly lucky to have him as a U.S. Senator. He's a model, I think, for what all politicians should be. obviously his dedication to what he does and his energy, he genuinely enjoys. He loves coming out to do events like this. You can see it on his face that this is what he lives for, and he's incredibly committed and honest, and he inspires even people, hardcore, cynical reporters like myself. I wrote about this I guess it was a couple of years ago, but I don't know how many people here are familiar with my work, but I'm sometimes a little bit profane. I have a tendency to characterize people using unfriendly language, and I realized people are clapping. There was one moment a couple of years ago where I was sitting down and I was going to write something really nasty about somebody, and a little voice in my head went off and said, God, if Bernie sees that, he's going to be disappointed in me. And I started to not do that as much. So I think he's become, a little bit my conscience. I think he has that impact on everybody. And he's really an inspirational figure. So thank you so much for having me here tonight. On Wall Street, I agree with everything Senator Sanders said. It's an incredibly difficult, consequential, weighty topic that is hugely underreported. My personal introduction to it began just after, actually it was just before Barack Obama was elected for the first time. And I was assigned to do a story about the financial crisis right after the election. I had never covered anything about Wall Street before. I had no background in economics. I could barely balance my checkbook, and I got assigned by my editors to write about the AIG bailout, which is an incredibly complex story, and I had to get up to speed really quickly about what Wall Street was all about. And so I tried to study up on economics first. I read The Wealth of Nations. I read John Kenneth Galbraith. I went back and read all these Austrian economists, and I thought learning about capitalism and high finance, I thought that would give me an insight into this world, but nothing really clicked for me until my wife and I actually went to a library sale, and I think it was New Brunswick, New Jersey, and I found this little tiny book, and it was called Great Con Men in History. And I started to read all these things there was one chapter in there about a guy named Victor Lustig who was famous for selling the Eiffel Tower twice. And all these cons, suddenly something triggered in my mind that this is what I'd been reading about, the subprime mortgage crisis was essentially a gigantic con scheme where banks were taking undervalued or near worthless properties, junk-rated mortgages, and they were using phony baloney math to disguise them as AAA-rated instruments. And then they were turning right around and selling these same instruments to pension funds and foreign trade unions and customers all around the world. And it was basically a street con scheme, the same thing that people do in New York City when they sell phony Prada handbags or phony Gucci watches. These were phony AAA-rated securities. And so as soon as I stopped thinking about the Wall Street story as an economic story and started thinking about it as a crime story, it started to make a lot of sense to me. And that's only been more and more true in the years since that I've had to cover this. Just this week, an enormous story broke that probably not many people have heard about. Has anyone here heard of ICAP? Nobody. ICAP is the world's largest swaps dealer. They were the world's largest dealer of interest rate swaps, among other things. There are a great many towns and cities and even countries that deal with their mounting debt burdens by swapping it out into the future if they have. Well, this is complicated. I won't even get into it. But the point is, ICAP earlier this week was busted, or the news broke that they had been colluding with 15 of the largest banks to manipulate the prices of interest rate swaps. And this affected hundreds of billions, perhaps even trillions of dollars worth of financial products. they've all been manipulated by some of these, it's a very small coterie of financial companies. It came out actually that these 15 banks and this one swap dealer, they had a nickname for this little club of theirs that was manipulating prices. They called themselves the Treasure Island Club. And this story came on the heels of another scandal that broke last year. I'm sure some people have heard of the LIBOR story. This is a very similar story to the ICAP business, but what came out beginning last year was that 16 of the world's largest banks, including the 6 companies that Senator Sanders referred to, were engaged in manipulation of LIBOR, which is the London Interbank Offered Rate, which is the rate at which banks lend to each other. LIBOR is the benchmark that basically everyone around the world uses to calculate interest rates. And LIBOR affects the price of just about everything: credit cards, mortgages, municipal debt, currencies as well. So when these banks got together, what they do, the way LIBOR works, is just a quick tutorial on this. Every morning, the 16 largest banks have to call a bureaucrat in London and report the prices at which they had borrowed money from each other the day before. And what these banks have been doing is reporting the wrong numbers systematically. And they'd been doing it perhaps as far back as 1991 or 1992. LIBOR affects the prices of hundreds of trillions of dollars of financial products. And very often what would happen was a trader at this or that bank would have an investment that would benefit by LIBOR going down. And he would call up the LIBOR submitter at his company. And we have all these email exchanges now because they've been made public thanks to a series of investigations. They'll send an email to, or call the LIBOR guy at their bank, and they'll say, "Can you push down the franc today?" Or "Can you push down the 6-month euro today?" And the guy will say in response, "Well, what's in it for me?" And these extraordinary answers come out. "Oh, I'll give you a bottle of Bollinger champagne," or "I've got some sushi rolls," or "I'll do a $50,000 deal for you." They'll openly talk about giving money to these people. These are open and shut cases of antitrust violations, probably the biggest price-fixing case in the history of finance, and there have basically been no consequences for any of it. In the last year or so, we've seen there have been 3 settlements. There was one with Barclays, which settled for just over $400 million, which is a drop in the bucket compared to how much money they got out of this. UBS, the Swiss bank, settled for just over $1 billion. The Royal Bank of Scotland settled for somewhere in between. But in this entire tableau, where hundreds and hundreds of traders, hundreds of people involved with submitting LIBOR numbers, out of all those people, there was one trader in Japan who was criminally charged. Nobody here in the United States was charged. There were no criminal penalties levied against any of these companies. And that's exactly what Senator Sanders was talking about. These settlements are what prompted those remarks by Eric Holder. They were basically, when people asked them, how can you not levy criminal charges in the biggest price-fixing case in the history of the world? This is exactly what the mafia used to do with the price of garbage pickup and delivery and laundry. But they're not going to prosecute any of these companies for any of this. But we've been told now, officially, openly, that we cannot prosecute these companies because they're too systematically important, that prosecuting them would have an adverse effect on the economy. And so we have a situation where there's open manipulation, where you can even be caught and there's no consequence for it. And the result of that is that the behavior keeps getting worse and worse. Now, when this first happened in 2008, when these companies committed mass fraud in the subprime mortgage markets and got away with it and weren't punished. There were a lot of people who said, well, that's it. That'll never happen again. You know, they'll come to their senses. They'll never do anything worse than that. Well, LIBOR was worse than that, and that happened, and there was no consequence for that. Another thing that happened, HSBC, one of Britain's largest banks, was caught in perhaps the largest money laundering scandal in the history of banking. Among other things, they laundered $880 million just for two drug cartels, one in South America and one in Mexico, including the Sinaloa drug cartel. They admitted to laundering hundreds of millions of dollars for Sinaloa, which is suspected in over 20,000 murders in the last 10 years. And there were no criminal penalties for HSBC. They, again, went out of their way to not penalize these companies. So we're in the situation now where, as the Senator said, these companies are not only too big to fail, there's not only an inherent market advantage for them because the entire world knows that they will be bailed out if they fail, but they can also commit crimes without consequence. And that is a terrifying thing. If the prices of everything can be rigged and people can be caught doing it and there can be no consequence, how can we possibly have any trust in the financial system going forward unless something is done about it? And that's why we need to get together. We need to educate ourselves about this and figure out what to do going forward. And so that's why we're here tonight. So I guess we'll open the floor up.
Okay, we're going to open it up to questions in a second. We have Phil and Harper were on either side. But before we do it, I want to begin with the first question. And the question I'm going to ask Matt is whether, in every institution, in the private sector, in government, academia, there are people who are dishonest, who are fraudulent. The question that I want to ask in a very serious way is whether fraud itself is the current business model for big finance in this country.
Well, I think it's. I think the answer is yes. One of the things I was talking to a lawyer who was involved in the lawsuit in the LIBOR case this morning, and he pointed to the fact that in the settlement, the LIBOR settlement with UBS that we entered into late last year, both the British government and the United States government wrote in the settlement that we now have a culture of manipulation that is entrenched at these companies, and that their instinct is to manipulate wherever they are able. And I've personally seen this, with the ICAP story and with LIBOR. This is interest rates and interest rate swaps being manipulated, which one person described it to me as being like if prices of both peanuts and peanut butter were being manipulated. It's manipulation on top of manipulation. I covered a story last year, a trial that was about manipulation in the municipal bond markets. Again, it was the same idea. It was a cartel-style corruption where a small group of companies were manipulating the rates for municipal bond service. We've seen cases involving manipulation in the gold and silver markets. In England, there was a case involving manipulation of insurance rates by some of these same companies. So what we've seen is an escalation of corruption where I think a lot of these companies are realizing that not only do they have an enormous amount of concentrated political power and a lot of concentrated economic power, but they also have the ability to make more money working together as opposed to being competitors. And that's a scary thing. It's a frightening escalation of the situation. And all the evidence that I've seen suggests that this is the way, sort of the way people do business now.
Okay, let's open it up to questions. Phil, where are you? Phil's here and Harper is over there. Just raise your hand, tell us who you are, and stand up and be loud.
Hi, I'm Ben Allen. I moved to Vermont a year and a half ago. I really like it here. My question is, it sounds like, are you suggesting that it's easier to prosecute the President of the United States and members of Congress than the heads of these corporations, which these aren't sole proprietorships, correct? I mean, I'm just asking.
The short answer is yes. Look, I will tell you a little story, and the ending is vague, but I will tell you the story. A number of years ago, after the bailout, several of us in the Senate weren't happy that the Obama administration was not more aggressive in going after Wall Street. And I think what was happening is, you all know that today, real unemployment is 14%. You know that when Bush left office, we were losing 700,000 jobs a month because of the greed and the recklessness and illegal behavior on Wall Street. You all know that. And the American people were furious, and they wanted to know a couple things. How did it happen? Who caused it? And how are we going to punish those people for the crimes that they committed? And frankly, the Obama administration, other than some lip service, really wasn't doing it. So some of us went to the White House, 7 or 8 of us, and we met with Obama. We met with Geithner. We met with Larry Summers. We met with his whole financial team. And it was just very clear to us, leaving the room, that there was a real reluctance for them to go forward. And I can't give you, the reason why, other than to tell you that you are dealing with people of extraordinary power. They have the power to sabotage the economy. During the Occupy movement, when there was a lot of discussion about Wall Street, Fox Television was very interesting. And what they were saying, some of you may have seen this, they were talking about a capital strike. They were talking that if the opposition of the people to Wall Street became so strong, that maybe Wall Street should start holding back its money and punish the economy, which they have certainly the capability to do. You're dealing with a time bomb, people of incredible wealth and power. And for obvious reasons and a variety of reasons, people are reluctant to stand up to them. Second of all, politically, it is no great secret that in Obama's first election, Wall Street supported him. Second time around, they supported Romney. But especially with Citizens United, these people have unlimited amounts of money. $10 million is nothing. $50 million is nothing. That is what we are up against. So taking these guys on is very difficult. We talked about this morning, maybe Matt wants to say a word. Just interesting, the change in culture in 20 years. You remember the old savings and loan crisis when we were a little bit younger? Hundreds of those bankers went to jail under Bush 1. Not a well-known, progressive, anti-Wall Street type guy. And maybe, Matt, you want to comment on just the difference in culture. Clearly, what we have seen recently is more severe than the S&L crisis, and yet we're not seeing too many of these guys going to jail.
Yes, we talked about this morning. Yeah, the S&L crisis, they went forward with 1,800 prosecutions. About 1,000 people really did go to jail in the S&L crisis, which was much smaller in scope and far less destructive than the subprime mortgage fraud crisis, where nobody was prosecuted. Actually, there was one prosecution, a significant one, of a couple of guys from a hedge fund in Bear Stearns. They had overwhelming documentary evidence in that case. These guys had been emailing each other about a bunch of subprime-based investments that they had, and they were laughing with each other like, we'll never make money in a million years with this stuff. This is going to be a loser forever. 2 days later, they're representing to clients that there's no problem. This stuff is never going to be a disaster. So they had this email chain. They had an open and shut case. They took it to a jury. They lost, and that was the last case they ever brought involving any of this stuff. So there's been an incredible change. Even 10 years ago, we talked about this under George Bush II. There were high-level prosecutions of the leaders of companies like Enron, WorldCom, Adelphia, If you remember, they actually dragged I think the 72-year-old CEO of Adelphia, John Regas, out of his bed at 9 o'clock in the morning, perp walked him on the streets of New York. That would never happen today, and these were for crimes that were far less impactful than the stuff that we're talking about now. So there's been some kind of sea change in the attitude involving prosecuting high-level CEOs of these companies, and it's kind of a mystery why that change has happened, but it's certainly something that has to be dealt with.
Hi, I'm Steve Beard from Montpelier. So you're a lawmaker, and that gives you certainly a great deal of power, but the Attorney General of the United States has said, if you pass a law, he's not gonna enforce, he's not gonna prosecute. And another thing is that Eric Holder was actually he worked to defend Goldman and some of the other large banks in a former life. So there's some capture there of another branch of the government, of the executive branch, really. So where's our leverage? How do we have an impact?
Good question. Let me tell you what we're trying to do. We're working in a couple of ways. We've just introduced legislation that would, I think, get to the root of the problem. My own view, captured in a soundbite, is if an institution is too big to fail, it's too big to exist. So we have introduced a pretty simple piece of legislation just last week. Reintroduced it, actually, and this is what it says. It says to the Secretary of the Treasury, you do an investigation and find out which institutions, which, if they failed, would bring systemic damage to our economy and require a bailout. You take a short period of time, you do that research, and then after you did that, you break them up. Simple as all that. Break them up. And I think the importance of that legislation is, number one, we want to protect ourselves from a too big to fail situation again and more bailouts. But equally important, think about, what Matt was just saying is interesting, and this is complicated stuff. I don't have all the answers by any means, but I think Matt's guess is probably right, that even in just a 20-year period, the culture of our willingness to take on these big money interests has significantly changed. The second issue, though, is not only too big to fail from a bailout perspective, it's from a broad economic perspective. You'll all remember Teddy Roosevelt, the guy who started breaking up Standard Oil and these other large institutions. From a competitive point of view, here's what's going on. From a financial point of view, if you are an institution that's too big to fail, you will attract capital. In other words, if you have the implicit guarantee of the United Faith and credit of the United States government behind you, and you could do no wrong, you're going to be able to attract capital at a significantly lower rate than a normal business can. You have a major financial institution advantage. And the second point, just from a competitive point of view, are we happy as a society that 6 financial institutions issue 2/3 of the credit cards in this country? Half of the mortgages in this country. The country is supposed to be about, you see it on TV, free enterprise, vigorous competition. So from not only the bailout perspective, but the issue of a competitive society, I think you've got to break these financial institutions up. So that's the major way that we're beginning to deal with that.
And just to add to that quickly, there was a study done just a few months ago, I believe, where they actually calculated how much that implicit guarantee of the United States government was worth to these companies. They figured it was a couple of Japanese economists, I believe, did it, and they came up with a number that it was worth, on average, the borrowing costs were about 0.8% lower, and they calculated that out to the 10 largest companies in the United States, and they figured that was worth about $83 billion just to those 10 companies, which the Bloomberg pointed out is roughly, it would be like the United States handing out 3 cents of every dollar collected in taxes to these companies. And I believe in the Senate there were a couple of votes about this, right? Where they were.
We have a vote around. I think there is growing sentiment. And here's the good news on this issue. If I can find it here, there are a number of us who are progressives who are concerned about this, but you should also know that you have some conservatives who are also talking about this issue. There's a guy named Mr. Fisher, who's head of the Dallas Fed. And what he is saying is that if you're serious about the financial soundness of the financial institutions, you got to break up these big financial banks. You're hearing columnists like George Will. You all know George Will, right-wing writer? He believes in breaking up these financial institutions. So I think we're seeing a coming together now of progressives and some conservatives who worry that when these guys are so big, they're going to be coming back to the taxpayers for a huge bailout. So we're making some progress on that.
Bernie, Phil French, Moncton, Vermont, and I keep tabs on you very, very much. And Mr. Taibbi, I was one of the first people to watch you on CNBC and NBC with what's his name, Schultz, Ed Schultz. And I'm on top of the game. But Bernie, we need names. We need the names of these people to make them accountable for what they're doing. And I'm coming back to how they dissolve us. They dissolved the 1%. They dissolved us down in Wall Street when we occupied it. What did they do? They come in and clear us out. We should have stayed there until they did what we told them to do. It seems, Bernie, we talk down there to you people. And I'm not talking, again, I want to come back to this, Bernie. When they say you people, I don't mean you particular, Bernie, because you're not in that class of senators and congressmen. You're not. And I hear you come back on the television and say, I'm not you people. But you know who we're talking about. And what I'm saying, it's time. We're really mad. I'm really mad. I'm being hurt. I just bought 20 acres of land. And what I went through to get my loan and how I was robbed out of it by Wells Fargo, lied to. I got a fixed interest rate, and all of a sudden the interest rate started going up. But you told me when I said, well, it's a variable. Well, you didn't say that to me and my wife when we sat there. They lied downright to us, Bernie. So what I'm saying is, why can't we take these 1% and take all of their money to pay for everything they did to us, including Halliburton, who sent our boys to war. Make them pay to repair our men that are hurt, that are in war. Thank you, Bernie.
Other than that, all right. Hey, look, here is the story. There is, you're absolutely right. There is, I believe, just a fierce amount of anger out there. This ties in. I think Wall Street is absolutely in the middle of it. But you are living in a society, as I think you well know, where to a significant degree, the middle class of this country is disappearing. Got 46 million people living in poverty. Here's just some statistics to back you up. In terms of distribution of wealth, which essentially is not allowed to be talked about on television, I want you to hear this. Top 1% today owns 38% of all of the financial wealth of America. That's bad. You want to hear what's worse? Who wants to guess what the bottom 60% of the American people own? What's the guess? All right. The answer is 2.3%. Top 1% owns 38% of the wealth. The bottom 60% own 2.3%. The bottom 40% own nothing. People who may have worked their whole lives, their homes are underwater, they own nothing. One family, the Walton family of Walmart, who is also the major welfare recipient in America, I'll tell you how in a second, own more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American people. One family worth $100 billion. And by the way, because they pay their workers so low wages, tens of thousands of their employees are on Medicaid, food stamps, and subsidized housing. So the federal government essentially is in partnership with Walmart and stabilizing or supporting their low-wage payments. They ask, what do we do about it? The answer is, we can get angry, and people are angry. But the answer is we also have got to be smart and think politically and understand, I just came back on a plane last night at midnight from Washington. I deal with the Tea Party every day. Tea Party is pretty smart. They don't just yell and scream, they organize. And they say to Republicans out there, unless you're prepared to cut Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and give tax breaks to billionaires, we're going to fight you. We're going to take you on in primaries. And we're raising money to beat you. So the few moderate Republicans, very few left, they get very, very nervous. They have organized effectively to move the Republican Party from what once was a center-right party to a right-wing extremist party. And it seems to me if we are angry as we should be angry, the word has got to go out to the Democratic Party that we can't have Democrats kowtowing to Wall Street, talking about cutting Social Security and Medicare if they want to survive politically.
Hi. I understand why the U.S. Attorney General won't prosecute these companies, even though they've admitted guilt, because they're puppets and they're afraid of these consequences. But if they've admitted guilt, wouldn't it be possible for groups of people to bring lawsuits against them? And if so, if they've admitted guilt, why couldn't that happen? I mean, shouldn't there be lawyers like slavering for the fees, these cases that would all win? Because, I mean, if for not moral reasons than just their fees.
Yeah. So, great example, LIBOR, right? Again, there have been 3 settlements, major settlements involving 3 of the 16 probable actors in this scandal. All of them massive settlements. There's no possible way that there was no wrongdoing involved. The government has come out and said in the settlements that there was wrongdoing. So there's no longer a factual issue. These settlements have established as a point of law that manipulation went on. However, while all these investigations, these government investigations and settlements were going on, there was a major private lawsuit where there were hundreds, actually thousands of plaintiffs, most of them cities and towns from around the United States, but also various individuals who lost money because of the manipulation of LIBOR. They sued basically all the banks that were involved, and yet that case was dismissed just 3 weeks ago. There was a sort of a routine motion to dismiss filed by the defense. Their defense was really funny. It was essentially, we committed fraud, not an antitrust violation, so this suit is invalid. The judge bought it, and she explicitly said that even though the bad conduct has been established in these prior settlements, she still nonetheless decided to rule against the plaintiffs in that suit. So yes, there should be lawyers all over the country slobbering over all of this conduct. And after the subprime mortgage crisis, there were a number of suits that went forward. And some of them were successful. But the problem is the same problem that Bernie has always been talking about. These companies have such a massive amount of resources that they can lawyer these things to death. It can take years and years and years before they even get into a courtroom. And even when they get into a courtroom, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, the very biggest of these suits can be thrown away just like that.
The point is there have been settlements. I mean, some of these guys have forked over hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. But as Matt said, to them, that's 25 cents to you. But whether you can get convictions and get these guys in jail is another story. Tell the story about Steve Cohen.
So Stevie Cohen is he heads SAC Capital, which is one of the biggest hedge funds on Wall Street. He has been involved. He was the unindicted co-conspirator in a major insider trading case last year. He has long been rumored to be involved in a number of insider trading cases. He's been the target of a number of investigations by a number of different regulators. A couple of weeks ago, he settled with the SEC for $600 million. And the same week that he settled, he went out and bought a $135 million Picasso, And he also bought a $40 million house in East Hampton next to his existing $40 million house in East Hampton. So this was basically a giant middle finger to everybody saying, yeah, I'll give you $600 million, but that's nothing to me, because it probably isn't. He's probably worth 10 times that. And that's, again, that just shows you the scale of the problem, that even when these guys get caught, which is extremely rare, even when there's the regulatory enthusiasm to go after them, they just get away with it in the end, most of the time.
Hi, Bernie. I'm Greg Ranke from Shelburne. You mentioned Wall Street, and you're focusing a lot on the white-collar criminals, but I'd like to get a response from you about the white-collar criminals that are populating the House and the Senate, because these people couldn't do their job. They couldn't steal us blind if we had a government of the people, by the people, for the people. So how do we take back our government from the people that are allowing this to happen?
Okay, shh. All right. I mean, the answer is, and I don't mean to be overly rhetorical here, dramatic, you need a political revolution. And what that means is you need, but it's easy. Look, I can, give you, radical speech and all that. This is tough stuff. The gentleman back there talked about Occupy Wall Street. They focused on two very important issues: the power of Wall Street, distribution of wealth and income in America. They were right in both instances. They went nowhere. All right, television cameras stopped, it ended. So the question is, how do you build a strong grassroots movement all over this country which says the government, as you just indicated, is supposed to work for the middle class and ordinary people and not billionaires? Now, the good thing we have going for us, and this I want all of you to understand, because you may not see it on television, all of the things that we are talking about tonight and stuff that we haven't talked about, and that is opposition to tax breaks for billionaires, a decent minimum wage, health care for all people. These aren't radical ideas. These are ideas that, one way or another, the vast majority of the American people believe in. People sometimes say to me, oh, Bernie, you're so courageous, you're doing this. I'm not courageous. All I'm saying is what the American people believe. You want to hear somebody who's courageous? Somebody who says, I want to cut Social Security and give a tax break to billionaires. That's enormously courageous, because nobody in the world believes that except the billionaires. So the point is, and this is tough, the point is, how do you develop that strong movement? How do you organize so that in North Dakota or in Oklahoma or in New York State or in New Hampshire, somebody says, well, I think it's tough times. I guess we're going to have to cut Social Security and Medicare, and maybe we're going to have to lower tax rates for large corporations. Why aren't, if tens of thousands of people are saying, you do that, you are out of office, and we're going to put somebody in office who's going to fight for us? That's the answer. But going from here to there ain't easy. It requires a level of organization. It requires raising money. It requires being tough. So the answer is that is exactly what we should do. And here's the good news in a certain sense. I happen not to believe. I don't believe in this red state, blue state nonsense. I never have. I do not believe that there is any state in this country, not the reddest of red states, not Oklahoma or any state, where working people believe that you give tax breaks to billionaires and you cut programs for kids and the elderly and the sick. I don't believe it. But what we need to do is get folks in Oklahoma, get folks in Mississippi. Do you know that Obama, without a campaign at all, got, I think, 44% of the vote in Mississippi, without any campaign, without any Democratic Party there? So the answer is the Democrats have got to do something that our former Governor Dean said. They need a 50-state strategy. They should be in every state in the country. They should worry less about getting contributions from big money interests. Try to raise millions of contributions of $50 or $30 apiece. Come up with a progressive agenda and work with grassroots organization to build a national movement. Now, in the process, there's going to be a good section of that party that has to probably leave office, the corporate wing of the Democratic Party. But that's, I think, and again, it's easy to say, it is a lot harder to do. You elected me, and I thank you very much, as the longest-serving independent in the history of the United States Congress. All right? And that wasn't, you know, we had to fight a long, long time to make it. So I think it can be done, because at the end of the day, what I believe in my heart is there's nothing to win. You know, if C-SPAN was here watching Matt talk, I would say that 80% of the American people say, Matt, you're absolutely right. Why the hell aren't we going after these guys? Why is big money running the country? That is what people in Oklahoma believe, in Mississippi, and in the state of Vermont. Having said that is one thing. Getting your hands dirty into organizing, bringing people together, developing a progressive agenda, that's tough stuff, but that is clearly what we have to do.
Thanks again. And here in Vermont, a number of us believe that one small step that we could take to help ourselves would be to establish a state bank. That legislation is S55, and it is stalled right now. VermontPublicBank.com. Is that a good idea?
Great question. And when you ask what we can do, some of you may know, that is, in my view, the idea of Vermont State Bank is exactly the right thing to do. Some of you may know that the state of North Dakota, which now is politically a very conservative state, has a state bank which has been extraordinarily successful. During the midst of the economic downturn, during the midst of the Wall Street financial crisis, they were doing just fine. And what's the concept behind the state bank? It's pretty simple. We pay state taxes, money goes into a state bank. Instead of giving that money to I don't know where it goes in Vermont, but instead of giving it to somebody else, the state bank invests the money in our own state, in agriculture, in areas where we need it, makes a decent rate of return. So number one, the money stays locally. And number two, we use that money to create jobs and improve the economy for our own people. That is what North Dakota has done. I think Vermont should follow.
Hi there, I'm Sasha. I work here in Burlington. And so my question is, with the two parties united in terms of cutting Medicare and Social Security, continuing imperialist war abroad, this drill baby drill approach to fossil fuel extraction, it seems like we're going to need if we're going to stand up to the banks and the corporations, we're going to need a real political alternative that's independent of the Democrats, and that we can't let our movements get funneled into the Democratic Party. For instance, we saw the Democratic mayors all over the country get together to crack down on Occupy Wall Street. So my question is, what do you have to say about the possibility of a true alternative to the Democratic Party?
What I have to say, let me answer it. I mean, I guess you're asking the politician who has done it. You know, maybe more than anyone else in the United States. And the state of Vermont has done it. We have shown that you can go outside the Democratic Republican Party. But it ain't easy. When Ralph Nader ran for president back in 2000 against Bush and Gore, and people were saying, Ralph, and I've known Ralph for many, many years, were saying, Ralph, you may help elect Bush and not Gore, and Gore's clearly a better candidate. Well, Ralph was saying, well, in so many words, we're going to build a third movement. Maybe I'm not going to win the election. We're going to build a Green Party all over the country. That's what he said. Not through lack of trying. It's not a criticism of Nader. It didn't happen. Green Party is not strong. So all that I'm saying is, in the state of Vermont now, we do have a progressive party. They have how many seats in the legislature, Phil? 6, 7, 8? All right. Vermont probably has the strongest progressive third party in the United States of America. All right. We've had third party here in the city of Burlington. It can be done. But all that I'm saying, and I certainly have no objection to that, but it's a hard task. It is a hard task. But if the people are prepared to do that, let's do it.
Yeah. Ken Erdley, Underhill. I'm a union member of Local 5109 of the United Nurse and Allied Professionals. I've been a union guy all my life. I was in the United Mine Workers when Richie Trumka was president. Now he's the head of the AFL-CIO. And my concern is, and I've been harping on this for years, is if you look at the history of social movements in this country, it's the civil rights movement, organization of the CIO, anti-war movement has always been masses of people in the streets showing their power and scaring the crap out of the politicians. So how can we get the union movement doing that again? I remember Solidarity Day. We had 1 million people in the streets of Washington, D.C. Why are they so reluctant to mobilize people? I mean, how do we get are you talking to these guys? We need to have demonstrations.
Let me answer in a couple of ways. I was just with Rich Trumka 2 days ago, okay? And in my view, Trumka is the best leadership the AFL-CIO has had for decades. Rich is a very good and decent guy working 24/7 trying to do exactly what you're suggesting. Now, one of the interesting, give you an example of how things work. Where did I see Trumka? I saw Trumka at a press event that we did in Washington on Thursday, I believe. We had the head of the AFL-CIO representing 12 million American workers. We had many members of Congress. Tom Harkin and I were there from the Senate. You know how much press coverage that event got? Virtually none. You didn't see it. And these guys were talking, so they, you know, when somebody says, well, the Democrats aren't doing anything, look, there are many Democrats who are not. There are some Democrats who are working very, very hard for working people. There was just a study that came out recently tracking how the major networks follow the AFL-CIO, follow unions. There's almost no coverage at all. I've done press conferences with Trumka, almost no coverage at all. So I would not make the criticism of Rich. He's trying to do his best. But clearly we need to grow the trade union movement, and that's something we are working on right now. He's doing a good job, in my view.
Bernie, you say the Tea Party's smart, but the Tea Party versus Occupy doesn't have to deal with the same thing. The Tea Party can go to rallies where the president is and come with their guns on. Occupy puts up tents, and they are followed by the FBI, Homeland Security, coordinated by the banks. We know this now. Coordinated by the banks. So where are our politicians in dealing with that? And you say the culture has gotten worse in politics over the last 20 years. So I think the politicians aren't innocent. And when I watched Eugene Jarecki's film about people losing their lives, going to jail, for their entire lives for small drug offenses, and HSBC gets away with money laundering to drug cartels, we have no justice system in this country. None. And what are our politicians doing about that?
Yes, I worked for Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan Chase most of my life.
You hold that mic a little bit closer.
I'm so
sorry.
sorry.
Can we get the mic system turned up just a little bit if we could, please?
Yes, thank you. I worked for Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan Chase most of my life. In terms of what can we do, you've suggested too big to jail. You've introduced legislation. With all due respect, because of the ability of the finance industry to finance Congress, I'm not sure that will work. I've seen Dodd-Frank defanged. The question is, why do we have these long electoral processes when in England, the founder of free speech, they have 3 weeks? If we could do that, that in itself would take care of the problems from the back door. I respectfully would love to hear your answer. Thank you, sir.
What you're saying, which I absolutely agree with, we have never-ending campaigns in this country. Literally, the day after the election, they're doing polls about who the next candidate for president is going to be. It never ends. So are we going to make progress unless we change the campaign finance system and the electoral system? I think we are not. What do we have to do? I mean, for a start, we have to deal with the disastrous Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which gives corporations the right to buy elections. That's a disaster. And I think we need to give some thought to stopping these endless elections which cost huge amounts of money. Now, one of the reasons of many, without going into great detail, that things don't get done in Washington, one of the reasons, you have no idea, and this is not casting blame, how much time it takes for candidates to raise money. On every single day, you have Democrats, you have Republicans going to the Republican Senate campaign office, Democratic campaign office, and you know what they're doing? They are dialing for dollars. Hour after hour, day after day, night after night. And it's easy to blame them, but within the context of how we live, it's not on them. If you have to raise $25 million or $50 million, that is what you have to do. So there's a lot of things that we have to do, in my view, to change the campaign finance system. It's not only ending this disastrous Citizens United, which is a horror beyond horror. What it does is not only give these companies the ability to buy elections, it intimidates members of the House and the Senate. Put yourself in their place. Let's assume you're a decent person trying to do the right thing. A vote comes up on Wall Street, and you're sitting there and you're saying, you know, if I cast this vote, I know that the next time I run for office, they're going to spend millions of dollars trying to defeat me. Maybe I better not cast that vote. So we've got a lot of work to do. The other thing that clearly we have to do in terms of election reform is end this unbelievably embarrassing situation where people are waiting 9 hours to cast a ballot. That's not what America's supposed to do. We got to move much more aggressively to same-day voting. We got to make it easier for people to vote, not harder for people to vote. It is not a secret that what our Republican friends are doing are two things. Number one, they are moving in the direction by which big money can buy elections, number one. Number two, what they are trying to do is make it harder for working people and minorities to vote. That's their two-pronged approach to how we win elections, and obviously we have to take both of those issues on. Yeah.
Throughout this whole conversation tonight, we haven't talked about the Federal Reserve at all and how they monetize our debt.
All right, you want to talk about the Fed? All right, let me start off by telling you, well, we did talk about the Fed a little bit. I talked about the fact that we are trying to bring at least a modest degree of reform. Let me talk about two things about the Fed. Sometimes there are strange bedfellows in Washington, and I work with Ron Paul. Some of you may remember Ron Paul. He was in the House for many years. All right. There's the Ron Paul fan club. All right. And I will tell you, I knew Ron when I was in the House, and obviously he and I disagreed on almost everything, but he was an honest guy, and I respect him. And what he and I both worked on together was the concept of auditing the Fed, to try to get an understanding of how the Fed was spending money and so forth, and creating money and so forth. As part of Dodd-Frank was a modest effort to deal with Wall Street, very modest. And I probably would not have voted. I voted for the bill. I probably would not have unless an amendment that I offered got accepted. And that amendment dealt with auditing the Fed, not totally, but within the 3 years of the financial crisis. And we had the GAO do that audit. And you know what we learned in that audit? What we learned, I think, and maybe Matt can pick it up because I know he followed that. This is what we learned. That during the financial crisis, the Fed lent out at zero interest or almost zero interest $16 trillion in a revolving loan fund, which went to every major financial institution in the United States, wealthy individuals and corporations like GE and McDonald's in the United States, and central banks all over the world. All right, so that's number one. Number two, what we are trying to do, as I mentioned earlier, is at least do a modest Fed reform to get bankers off of regional Feds so you don't have the fox guarding the henhouse. So those are some of the things we're doing there.
And just to follow up on that, I think both this question and the question before about where the woman suggested that nothing can be done about too big to fail, I totally disagree. One thing that is absolutely apparent with these companies is that they are totally dependent upon this endless flow of free money from the Federal Reserve. Without it, they would be dead. And we saw explicit proof of this during the financial crisis in September of 2008 when both Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley realized in the third week of September that if the doors opened the next morning, without access to the Federal Reserve's discount window, that they would go out of business. So a deal was hastily arranged on a Sunday night to allow Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, which are not commercial banks, which have no deposits, a deal was arranged to allow them to become commercial bank holding companies, to declare themselves commercial banks, so that the next morning they could start withdrawing billions and billions of dollars at 0% interest. And that move was the only thing that kept those companies alive. We are in a situation now where the entire financial sector realizes that these companies are wholly dependent upon the cheap money that they get from the Fed. Another example of this was when Carl Levin, your colleague, released a report about Goldman Sachs that sharply criticized its behavior during the financial crisis. The Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations did a massive report detailing all sorts of horrible things that Goldman had done. When that report came out, there was an immediate 6 or 7 point drop in Goldman's share price because analysts came out and said that this report perhaps signals an unwillingness on the part of the government to stand behind Goldman in the future. And just because of the perception that the government may not stand behind this bank, that cost Goldman billions of dollars of share value overnight. So these companies are extremely vulnerable to any change in the perception that we are not standing behind them. So once that perception changes, that's why all of these things that are going on in the Senate now, these various bills that are coming up, yours and Sherrod Brown's, the Brown-Vitter amendment, they're all significant because they are sending a signal to the rest of the world, to the financial markets, that things may be changing. Even that perception is extraordinarily significant and may restore some competition to the markets.
Doug Kemmer, Essex Junction. I have two questions for the speaker. Risk really magnifies when you're allowed to invest 1% of the assets and then loan and borrow 99% of the assets, and that's how you make a lot of money. So Glass-Steagall and Basel III have required more assets behind the banks, and I think that solves a lot of the problem. But you have not addressed derivatives, options, where you can make a lot of money because you can get a lot of leverage, or you can fail and be in a big mess like we were in 2008. So that was a question. And for Sanders, we brought up the issue of insider trading, and I'd like to know why Congress and staff members are exempt from insider trading rules.
Let me briefly answer the second. They are not. There was legislation passed to end that.
Sure. On the issue of derivatives, you're absolutely right. That's a crucial problem. The derivatives market is completely unregulated, or almost completely, as a result mainly of a law that passed in the year 2000, actually in the waning days of the Clinton administration, called the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. That law essentially exempted all derivatives from almost any form of regulation. The law was so sweeping that it actually exempts Wall Street companies from state gaming laws because the behaviors of some of these derivatives trades are so identical and indistinguishable from gambling that without affirmative deregulation, federal deregulation, they would have been in danger of being prosecuted for gambling. Because that's what some of these things are, like a naked credit default swap. I know that name sounds ridiculous, but all it really is two banks gambling on whether a third party can repay his loan. And it's ridiculous. It's like somebody taking out an insurance policy and his neighbor betting on whether or not his house is going to burn down. That kind of stuff is still legal, and even though Dodd-Frank, there was an enormous attempt to try to bring this to heel and place derivatives under some kind of regulatory framework, it really kind of missed the mark, and I think that was really one of the big failures of Dodd-Frank was that obviously when after the crash in the 20s, there was this idea that we had to put stocks and bonds on regulated exchanges because everything had to be transparent. We had to be able to see what the prices of things were. And we had the opportunity, I think, to do that again with derivatives, which are the sort of modern, which is where all the action is now. And that wasn't done, and that's something that's still left undone after Dodd-Frank.
Let me just, if I could, briefly tell you another story related to what Matt was talking about. It is where Wall Street speculation impacts every person in this room. When you ask why the price of gas at the pump is as high as it is, there are a number of reasons. But here's one of the key ones. Right now, the oil futures market, which theoretically, when you think about oil futures, you're talking about people buying oil and bidding on oil who actually use oil, like airline companies, trucking companies, fuel dealers. Today, approximately 80% of the oil futures market is controlled by Wall Street speculators, people who never use the product. And there are various estimates as to how much that increases the cost of a gallon of gas that you put into your car, but it is very, very significant. You mentioned that this afternoon.
Yeah, there were actually originally very strict controls about the amount of speculation that could take place in the commodities markets. The Commodity Exchange Act, which was passed during FDR's time, I think it was 1936, it basically set limits on the amount of speculation and set forth that most of the people on these markets had to be what they called physical hedgers. In other words, real consumers or producers of oil or wheat or soybeans or whatever kind of commodity you're trading. But beginning in the early 90s, a lot of these Wall Street companies started quietly applying to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which is the federal body that regulates commodities trading, and they started asking for exemptions. They started saying, yeah, well, we're speculators, but we'd like to be treated as physical hedgers. The first company to do that was called J. Aron, which is a subsidiary of Goldman Sachs. They wrote in 1991, and they got one of these letters. 16 companies later did the same thing, and that's why we have this explosion of speculation in the commodities markets. I saw a statistic in 2003. There was something like $25 billion of speculative money in the commodities markets. By 2007, that number was over $300 billion. And most investing on the commodities markets, unlike the stock market where you can bet for or against something, you can go long or short. Basically, when people invest in commodities, they're always going long. So they're betting on prices to go up. So when you multiply the amount of money, speculative money, by a factor of 10 on the commodities markets, that's when you start seeing all these enormous price rises in oil and gas and food and wheat and grain all over the world. And this has an enormous effect on the way people live everywhere, not just the United States.
Yeah.
My name is Rob. I live in Barry, which is a town many people are familiar with. It's got a lot of low-income people. It's been beaten up by the decline of the mining industry. A lot of what you're saying resonates with me in terms of the diagnosis, but a lot of what you're saying about what the solution is, I disagree with. I feel like there's this sort of, we all see the same problem with big bankers, casino capitalism, and therefore all roads lead to liberalism. All roads lead to a more progressive state. The state's going to save us. It's going to break the trust. We're going to defend the social safety net. And I got to say, I don't have a whole lot of faith in the state. I look at the federal government. I see 2 million people behind bars. I see, drug addicts who are held in cages. I see a system that defends private property rights above the economic and fundamental human rights of my community. And so I'm sorry, but I have a hard time getting on board with what you're saying. And to me, the answer is to give up on the liberal dream and embrace what's more of an anti-imperialistic sentiment that says that what we need is to be free. And we can take care of each other. All this money is only good if we think it has power over us. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, I don't agree. I mean, it's in this sense. I mean, and thank you for your question, and I appreciate absolutely where you're coming from and your sincerity. But here's the point: we can't all take care of each other. You got 50 million people today who are uninsured, who have no health care. How are you going to take care of those people? You think charities are going to do it? You think the churches are going to do it? 45,000 people today are dying because they don't get to a doctor when they should. So I believe, I guess, we have a difference of opinion, that the United States should join the rest of the industrialized world and pass a national health care system guaranteeing health care to all people. So, and I understand, look, I do understand. I'm the last guy in the world to be defending the government and the corruption that goes on there. It's domination by big money. So, I don't disagree with you with that. But don't give up the dream, I think, that it's every person for himself. I understand, what the libertarian thing is. Get the government off my back. When I go to work, I don't want a minimum wage. I want to work for $3 an hour. I don't want any health care. I don't want my kid to go to college. I want to be free. I don't believe that. I don't believe that. I believe that in a democratic, civilized society, we have the capability of providing health care to all people. Not a utopian dream. In May, we're going to bring, I think it's going to be maybe in Winooski and down in Brattleboro, we're going to bring the ambassador from Denmark. You know what they do in Denmark? They provide college education for their kids for free. They provide health care to all of their people. They have a strong child care program. They're strong on the environment. I understand where you're coming from, believe me, and I understand your anger and disgust and frustration. But the dream is not that every person is out there on his own. Somebody who's homeless is out there on their own. I don't believe that. Somebody who's 75 years of old, who can't work, who can't have health care, abolish Medicare, I don't think so. So the goal, I appreciate the frustration. And it ain't easy. Look, when you think about history, this country started doing terrible things to Native Americans. We had people in slavery. Women couldn't own property. Women couldn't vote. On and on and on. We have made progress in a number of areas. We have a long way to go, and the toughest fight of all is not gay rights. It's not the environment. It's not gender equality. You know what the toughest fight of all is? Taking on the big money interest. Frankly, they don't stay up nights worrying about discriminating against gay people. They don't stay up nights worrying that a woman could become president. That's not their worry. Their worry is that the American people will demand social justice in this country and a decent life for all, and not allow a handful of billionaires to control the economy. That's their nightmare, and we've got to stand together to take them on.
Just if I could quickly address that gentleman, sir. Just quickly, if I could just quickly answer your question. Let's play devil's advocate. Most of my sources, actually, I've been covering this for years. The same people who are feeding me all this information, who have been outraged about what's going on Wall Street, they almost all agree with you. Politically, they're on your side. Their attitude towards Wall Street is the number one problem that we have is that all of these companies are backed by the United States government. And so I think there's room for everybody in this argument. I think we all want the same things. I think conservatively and from a libertarian point of view, it's a matter of national emergency to get the government no longer, to disentangle them from these 6 or 7 or 10 large companies that have the backing of the United States government, that have all of us paying for their future mistakes. I think we agree that that's not tenable. And so I think that we're all in agreement about this, and it's not a conservative or liberal argument. I think it's everybody is on the same side.
Maybe a couple of more questions. Phil, you got somebody there? Yep.
Hi, my name is Amir from Boston.
Can you hold that mic close to your mouth, please?
Amir from Boston.
Yep.
2 quick questions. What would actually realistically happen if J.P. Morgan or Goldman Sachs, these too big to fail companies, actually went under? Number 1. Number 2, can you talk briefly about what Iceland did during its financial crisis? Thank you.
Well, I'll tell you, in terms of Iceland, we're going to be meeting in a couple of weeks with the president of Iceland, and I'll be better prepared to tell you what Iceland did. But Iceland did not do what the rest of the world economy countries did. They did it differently, and apparently they did it successfully. Their unemployment rate today is, I think, about 5%, and their economy is doing fairly well. They have recovered a lot better than other countries. I'll tell you more in a couple of weeks when we meet with the president. You know, the issue of what would happen if J.P. Morgan Chase collapsed, you know, who knows? I mean, the threat was the legitimate threat. It starts a chain reaction, which will lead to the defunding and the inability of companies to get capital and massive unemployment. Now, can I tell you exactly what will happen? I don't know, but that's certainly the fear. I think it's a legitimate fear.
My name is Paul Mackey. I live in South Burlington.
Well, hold that mic a little closer.
Since I suspect that your attempt to break up 6 institutions that control $9 trillion worth of wealth will probably be a little difficult. In the interim, since the primary crutch that these companies use to say, well, you can't let us fail because the systemic function that we provide to the financial system is too important and we need to fund, et cetera. Why couldn't we establish a government agency whose sole function during such a crisis would be to assure the liquidity of the money supply and allow that company that should fail to fail, do the prosecutions if necessary, but a government agency that would basically provide that systemic function and remove that crutch from the argument, basically?
Well, there was an attempt to do that during Dodd-Frank. There were numerous attempts, if I'm not mistaken. There were heavy debates about something they call OLA, Orderly Liquidation Authority, which attempted to create industry-funded funds that would be there to help companies fail without the taxpayer having to pick up the bill. The model was sort of based on the idea of the FDIC, which of course still exists and does provide some of those functions. But the amount of money that we're talking about to back up one of those failing companies is far bigger than what they came up with in Dodd-Frank, and those plans never really made it very far, if I remember. Is that true? So I absolutely agree with you. I think that's a common concern, and that was very much talked about during Dodd-Frank. That, you know, if we can't break up these companies, at the very least, let's in the interim figure out a way to prepare for the eventuality of one failing and do it in a way that doesn't require a massive late night infusion of $700 billion, you know, where somebody is coming to 100 senators and saying, you know, we need $1 trillion tomorrow or else the world is going to end. I think we need better preparation than that, and I think something like that eventually will take place.
Phil? Yep.
Hi, my name's Earhart. I live here in Burlington. I've worked in affordable housing for many years. I have a question about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and just wanted to hear your perspective on those. These are government-sponsored enterprises, which we as taxpayers now own. They were one of the casualties of the financial crisis. Some conservatives have argued that they were part of the cause, and their future, since they hold probably most of the mortgages that folks have in this room, their future, I think, is really critical, and some would argue that they were part of what helped build the middle class and helped build home ownership in the United States. I know Jeb Henserling, for instance, in House Financial Services wants to basically abolish them and have no government role in the mortgage market at all anymore. So I'm just interested in hearing how you think that should go forward and how we can continue to have home ownership in this country without them.
That's a great question. This gets to one of the central fallacies of the sort of counter-argument about what happened in 2008. If you remember, during the Occupy movement, Mayor Bloomberg got up and said all these people are misinformed. You know, this whole crisis was caused because the government forced these poor banks to lend mortgages to all of these, these people. Nothing could be further from the truth. What really happened, obviously, was that these banks figured out through the miracle of techniques like securitization, through the inventions of instruments like CDOs, that they could create massive amounts of junk-rated mortgages and then resell them as AAA-rated instruments to customers around the world. And they made an enormous amount of money doing that, and that is why what they would essentially do, you'd have a company like Bank of America or Goldman which would lend $1 billion to a company like Countrywide, which would go out into the world, make as many loans as they could overnight. They would resell them back to the bank would chop it up, turn it into AAA rated securities, sell them around the world. People didn't know what they were buying. It was a fraud scheme. And they were making an enormous amount of money, and nobody had to force them to do it because they were making money hand over fist, and that's why they created so many of these mortgages. In that tableau, Fannie and Freddie did play a role, but they were a customer of these. They bought these mortgages. Not as many. They weren't allowed to dabble in subprime, but they did play a role in creating more liquidity in this market. I'm a firm believer that Fannie and Freddie should exist. That there should be some assistance for low-cost housing. I think it provides a valuable service, but it should be managed in a way that doesn't put the taxpayer at risk, which is what happened in 2008. But it's important to recognize that Fannie and Freddie, when people use that catchword, the ordinary person out there, what they're trying to do is convince them that Fannie and Freddie somehow forced these banks to create those mortgages, and that is not the way it worked out. It has no connection to reality at all.
Deborah from Burlington. Can you give concrete suggestions or concrete steps you would recommend for ordinary citizens to have some impact on Citizens United?
Where we're at right now is there are several constitutional amendment pieces of legislation offered in the House and Senate. I've offered one. Others have offered equally good pieces of legislation. There are, I believe, at last count, at least 9 states, including the state of Vermont, that have gone on record in support of overturning Citizens United. There are hundreds of communities, many hundreds, including many in the state of Vermont, that have gone on record. What our job is, and I think this is, just a wonderful organizing effort, because it brings people across the political spectrum together. Very few people, whether you're conservative or progressive, think that it is consistent with American democracy that a handful of billionaires can buy elections. So the goal now, and what we're trying to do, working with groups like Public Citizen, is grassroots efforts all over this country to have city councils, state legislatures go on record to put pressure on Congress to pass a constitutional amendment. I would not kid you and tell you this is going to be a short-term effort. It's going to be a long-term effort. Furthermore, I would hope that as we get new members of the Supreme Court, the very first issue that a new majority should look at is this disastrous decision. But that's kind of where we're moving now. Okay.
Okay. Hi, my name's Andre from New York. Got to thank Matt for Grifftopia, which got me down to Occupy. So thanks for that. My question's kind of like a psychological question about the threshold we have to kind of cross in our mind. I mean, it's easy to say the Democrats, but it's another thing to say Obama. And what's that kind of threshold we need to cross to say, he's the guy? You were talking about the book, you have the greatest con artist in the world. And with the Social Security chain CPI, I mean, it's kind of hard to, believe more. He's the cool guy who can tell jokes. He's smooth, he can sing jazz, whatever, blues, B.B. King. How do we cross that threshold? And as you in the media, how hard has it been for you to inject any of that? Because I remember seeing you on Alex Wagner once, and you tried to say, well, he got the most from Wall Street, and they all kind of just shut off. And how do we make that leap in our minds to really understand him as a person?
Oh, it's a great question. Thank you. I want to tell a story about that. When I was covering Obama in his first race for the presidency, when I first got on the plane, I noticed that the walls of the plane were decorated with photos. Each of the members of the press that were on the plane had managed to get themselves photographed with their arm around President Obama. It was like a yearbook ritual or something like that. And you know, it's a campaign thing. It's true of all campaigns, Republican and Democrat. But the candidate always sort of comes back to the press section for as long as he can tolerate, once per flight, and you know, kind of hangs around with the reporters. But when Obama would come back, there would be oohs and ahs from all the reporters, and it was really unprofessional. I mean, I liked Obama. I voted for him. I had high hopes for him. I thought his election was an inspirational thing, but you have to have sufficient distance in this business and professional distance, and I think that sometimes that is lost. I think people need to. I always thought that Obama was a conventional Democrat. I thought it was unrealistic to think of him in any other way, but there was he had this iconic presence that I think has overwhelmed a lot of people in the media and blinded them, particularly to issues like this, where you know, his record isn't so good, but it conflicts with the public image of him as our savior. And yeah, so it's an unfortunate thing, but we need to get past that.
Let me just add, I really don't think the issue is to understand the psychology of Barack Obama. That's not what's important. This I would guarantee you. A few million people marched on Washington, said break up the banks. The next day Barack Obama would lead the effort to break up the banks. Look, the political reality is he looks around him, and he understands, as do people in the Democratic and Republican Party, that you got to get reelected. You want your friends to get reelected. You go where the money is, and you do it the folks who have the money. The assumption is that the American people are not going to stand up and fight back. Our job is to do just that. Right now, you know, it amazes me. One of the, you know, differences now than in past times, the 30s, the 60s, is we need people, we need young people out on the street saying, I don't want to graduate college $50,000 in debt and not find a job. Start creating the millions of jobs that our people need. Why is it that all over Europe, Scandinavia, college education is virtually free? What does it cost to go to UVM? $30,000, $40,000 a year? Why is that? What are we going to do about it? So what we need to do at the end of the day, and this is what I believe, people have asked a lot of really great questions, but at the end of the day, you need a transformation of the political system. You need Washington to start responding to ordinary people. That does not happen unless you make Washington an offer they can't refuse. And that is, they're going to get thrown out of office unless they start doing what the American people want. You talked about the chain CPI. I've been working on that issue for a year. And let me tell you, the overwhelming majority of the American people do not believe you cut Social Security or benefits for disabled vets. Left alone, if we don't stop them, that's exactly what they are going to do. So our job is to rally the American people to say, hey, stop worrying about your wealthy friends, start worrying about us. And that's really what we've got to do. Maybe one last question. Harper, you got one over there? Yeah.
Yes, Bruce Marshall from Rochester, Vermont, former candidate for Congress from Vermont. I'm very encouraged by this meeting. It means a lot to all of us, what we're doing and what we're up against. That encouragement is encouragement to you. Encouragement to go further, actually. To encouragement to go to the heart of the matter. I feel that this anti-TB TF, anti-too big to fail, does not go to the heart of the matter. I feel that what you need to do is to go forth and support Glass-Steagall as Captor Sanders. Captor Sanders would be that message. For the message of Glass-Steagall is this, in its preface, and this is the National Banking Act of the Banking Act.
Hold the mic in front of your mouth.
The Banking Act of 1933. Our courage is we won before. FDR and what the American people did is we put the bankers in their place. It goes back to the preamble of the Constitution, which says that we promote the general welfare, not welfare for Wall Street. So Glass-Steagall says that we are going to prevent the undue diversion of funds into speculative operations. Now, there's other things that it does, But I feel if we don't go to this far and to this standard, people have already said that you're just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. They don't have any assets. They are bankrupt. The whole thing's going down.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay, thank you. All right, let me, first of all, thank you all for coming out tonight. This is a great turnout. And second of all, you know, what I believed, and I think your presence here tonight tells me that I was right in this. These are complicated issues. These issues you're not going to read about too much on the front pages of the paper. These are the most important, some of the most important issues facing our society. We are not going to expand the middle class. We're not going to end poverty unless we address the power and the greed and the illegal behavior on Wall Street. This is not an easy fight. The power and money that these people have is beyond comprehension. But we don't go forward unless we understand better about what they are doing. So I just want to conclude by thanking Matt Taibbi for being with us today and for the great work that he has done for so many years. Thank you all very much.